including tonight, discussing matters of Pesach. And we're going to begin with a very, very short piece from the Tzaddok, and we're going to see that this branches out in some very, very complex ideas. The Tzaddok wrote a sefer called Tzaddok, which is really a guide to piety. And this is the very first paragraph in the work. He writes, Reishis Knisas Ha'adam L'Avodas Hashem. The beginning of a person's entry into the service of God, Tzarech Lios B'chipazon. It must be in haste. It must be in haste. It must be swift. It must be energetic. It must be almost reckless, if you will. Mm-hmm. And he draws an analogy. We know that we have the Korban Pesach. And the Korban Pesach, the first year, was brought in Mitzrayim, the night before the Yetzias Mitzrayim. And from that point onward, it became an annual observance. So the first Korban Pesach that was brought in Egypt is called the Pesach Mitzrayim. And the annual observance of Korban Pesach is called Pesach Doros, the eternal Pesach, which spans generations. The Mishnah says that there are differences, that the halachas aren't exactly the same. One of the differences is that in the Pesach Mitzrayim there was the halacha that it was eaten b'chipazon. It was eaten in a hasty manner, meaning it was eaten in a way that indicated that the people were in a rush to leave. They were wearing their walking shoes, they were carrying their walking sticks. She ate it in haste. That halacha only applied in Mitzrayim, which of course was the night before the Exodus. L'doros, for eternity, there's no such halacha. So in the annual eating of the Korban Pesach, you don't have to wear shoes, you don't have to have a walking stick. There's no such halacha. So Tzaddok says this is symbolic. It's symbolic of the idea that a person's entry into Avodas Hashem has to be b'chipazon. Like we find regarding the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim. It was eaten in haste, below Pesach Doros, and not the Pesach which is brought for eternity. Now, this presupposes something which is not so obvious. It really is an insight into the very nature of Korban Pesach. Without going into the detail of it, there are really two different aspects of Korban Pesach. One is that it is the rejection of the value system of Mitzrayim. The deity of Mitzrayim was the tle, was the sheep, and slaughtering the sheep, eating the sheep, roasting the sheep, eating the sheep, this is a repudiation, this is a rejection of the Avodah Zarah, of the deity of Mitzrayim.
What did they do with the sheep?
They worshipped it. Now, when you say they worshipped it, I'll tell you something interesting. A few years ago, I had the great pleasure to be in London for my niece's wedding, and I had the extra pleasure of Friday being able to go to the British Museum, which was really one of the very, very satisfying experiences. It's just fantastic. You know, if you have one museum in the world to go to, make sure it's the British Museum. So there are many interesting things there. You know, the Rosetta Stone, you know, you can see it, it's just fantastic. But they had there some artifacts from Egypt, of course, and from the Upper Nile, which is the southern Nile. The Upper Nile, because its source is in the south, in Ethiopia, and it flows towards the Mediterranean. So the Upper Nile, Ethiopia, etc. And they had a statue of a sheep, a massive sheep, and under the chin of the sheep was the king of this region. And the idea was that the sheep was the protector of the king. And it was just so satisfying just to see this, because it's like the Chumash comes alive. But in any case, That's one aspect of the Korban Pesach. One aspect of the Korban Pesach is negative. It's the rejection. It's the destruction of the Avodah Zarah of Mitzrayim. And of course, that's a precondition to leaving Mitzrayim. You can't leave Mitzrayim until you leave Mitzrayim behind you. You can't take Mitzrayim out with you. So you have to reject it, you have to destroy its deity, and then you can leave Mitzrayim. There's also another aspect of Korban Pesach, which is that it is a carbon, like every carbon, and it is a form of Avodas Hashem. And the Maharal explains this. He's going on the famous Rashi, which quotes the Bible Chazal, that the Jews were lacking positive merit for which they could be redeemed. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them two mitzvahs. He gave them the mitzvah of Bris Milah and the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, both of which involve blood, of course. And that's the idea of B'damai Chayi, that through the mitzvahs that are related to blood, we have the merit for redemption. And the Maharal explains that why were there two mitzvahs? Why did we need Milah and Korban Pesach? So the Maharal explains with a legal analogy. There's a halacha that tashmishay kedusha, accessories to holy objects, are can only be used for holy purposes. They can't be used for mundane purposes. So if you have a tefillin bag, for example, you can't put change in a tefillin bag. You can't put other things in a tefillin bag because it's an accessory to the tefillin. Now the Gemara says that the tefillin bag only becomes forbidden if two conditions are met. Azmenei v'tzarbei. The bag must be designated for the tefillin, and it must have been used for the tefillin. But azmenei v'lo tzarbei, it was designated but not used. Or it was tzarbei, it was used for the tefillin but not designated. For example, you put tefillin in a paper bag, so it wasn't designated explicitly for the tefillin, it was used for the tefillin. It doesn't become sanctified. You have to have two conditions. It has to be azmenei v'tzarbei, it has to be designated for the tefillin and used for the tefillin. So, likewise says the Maharal, for us to become God's servants, there are two things required. One is that we designate ourselves as God's servants. That's the azmenei. We designate ourselves as God's servants. And secondly, it has to be tzarbei. It has to be that we actually perform an act of service. Here you have to have two things. In other words, we have to designate ourselves as God's servants, and you have to actually perform an act of service. So Bris Milah, says the Maharal, this is how we designate ourselves as God's servants. We designate ourselves through the Bris Milah. The Bris Milah is the badge, so to speak, that the slave carries. And that's the azmenei, that's the designation. But again, that's not enough. We don't become God's servants until we perform our first act of service. That's the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim was the first act of avodah, the first act of divine service. So with the combination of Bris Milah and Korban Pesach, this is how we become God's avodim, we become God's people. So there's two different aspects of the Korban Pesach. It's the rejection of the values of Mitzrayim, and on the other hand, it's our entry into Avodas Hashem. That's the aspect which the Maharal, Tzaddok emphasizes over here, that the Korban Pesach is our kinisa, it's our entry into Avodas Hashem. This is how we become God's servants. Right? We've had the Bris Milah, so we've designated ourselves, but this is our first act of service. And in the Pesach Mitzrayim, there's an element of chipazon, there's this element of haste. It has to be done in a hasty way. And that's because the beginning of a person's entry into Avodas Hashem has to be that way. It isn't done deliberately, it isn't done slowly, it isn't done step by step. You take the plunge, you take the leap. And he explains, Mipnei, because Shahaschala, the beginning, L'natek atzmo mikol taivas ha'olam hazeh, shemuchusher behem, to remove oneself from all the pleasures of this world to which we are bound, Sarach lishmor haregash misorir b'rachon Hashem. You have to guard the moment in which the yearning for God is aroused. The lachpa is alos rega, and you have to rush to realize the possibilities of that moment. L'maher, to hurry. Lotzeis mehem, to escape from the gravitational pull, if you will, of the worldly desires. Ula yuchal, perhaps you'll be successful. You know, I think the metaphor of the gravitational pull is very, very apt. Earth has a very, very strong gravitational pull. If you launch a rocket or a projectile from up, from the Earth going up, it'll travel up to a point, but sooner or later what comes up must come down. In other words, gravity will overpower the thing because it doesn't have enough momentum to break the gravitational pull of the Earth. Essentially, if you really want to do that, you have to have something like a Saturn V rocket. Then it has enough thrust that it can break the gravitational pull. And it's the same thing. There's a tremendous inertia, tremendous pull that this world has. It drags us down. And if we want to escape it, we have to rush. We have to be hasty. We have to be bold. We have to take advantage of that moment where the desire is aroused, because otherwise we're not going to be successful. And after that, then you go slowly, kedin Pesach Dairos, like the eternal korban Pesach, which is brought year after year, which is not eaten b'chipazon, it's eaten in a very deliberate way. So Tzaddok tells us that this is the derech of Avodas Hashem. I'll give you an example where I think that we see a Jewish custom that's based on this understanding. The first night of Shavuos, so there's a custom to stay up the entire night and learn Torah. Now we all know that from a pedagogic perspective, this is not the most efficient way to learn something. You stay up all night, you're half asleep, you're 3/4 asleep, maybe you're 90% asleep, you're yawning, you're making trips back and forth to the coffee urn, and you're half listening, you're trying your best to stay awake. The argument can be made, if I would get a good night's sleep, Shavuos, it's a long day the next day, I'll go to shul, I'll have a quick Suda, I can be finished by noontime, Mincha isn't until 8 p.m., I have 8 solid daytime hours I can devote to learn it. It would be more effective, I'd probably learn a lot more. The answer is, yeah, you learn a lot more, but Shavuos has nothing to do with learning. It's not the idea at all. Shavuos is renewing the Kabbalah Satorah. And that has to be done with haste. It has to be done with excitement. It has to be done with the energetic first move. And that's the idea. It's something bold. You stay up a whole night. That's not. And you learn Torah. Of course, it's not efficient. And it's not the point. Of course, it's not the most efficient thing. But that's the idea, that the beginning of one's entry requires chipazon. And after that you go bahadrog. After that you go step by step. And really, that's what the first night of Pesach is. The first night of Pesach is a new beginning in the cycle, the annual cycle of Avodas Hashem. And therefore there's this element of chipazon. And after that we go bahadroga. Now the truth is, this is an idea which Tzaddok expands elsewhere in the second piece. And it's a very interesting thing. We know that starting from the second day of Pesach, we count the Omer leading up to Shavuos. And there are several questions that present themselves regarding Spheres Omer. The Chinuch already points out that the purpose of the sphere is to connect the Yetzias Mitzrayim and the giving of the Torah. Because we all understand that the objective, the immediate objective of Yetzias Mitzrayim was to bring us to Har Sinai and give us the Torah. So therefore, to connect the two, to show that they're related, that the one is really a preparation for the other, we start counting. But there are some problems, some technical problems. Number one is, why do we count up? We should count down. But if the whole idea is anticipation, we're awaiting Kabbalah Satorah, breathless anticipation, so normally you count down. 49 days left, 48 days left, 47 days left, 46 days left. Instead we count up. So what does that mean? Number two, if we're really connecting Yetzias Mitzrayim to Matan Torah, why do we start counting from the second day? We start counting from the first day. The Chinuch attempts to answer that question. But it's a question nevertheless. Another interesting question is from the wording of the Pasuk. When the Torah says that you count from the day that follows the first day of Pesach, the wording of the Torah is Usfartem lochem mimochras haShabbos. You start counting from the day that follows Shabbos. Now, Shabbos in this context does not mean the seventh day of the week. Shabbos means Yom Tov. The first day of Yom Tov here is called Shabbos. Now, historically, there was an error that was made on this point, that Tzdukim, who were literal interpreters of Torah, who rejected the Masorah, traditions of Chazal, held to the contrary, that Shabbos here should be understood as Saturday, and you always start counting not the day after the first day of Pesach, but the day after the Shabbos that follows the first day of Pesach. So Seir always starts on a Sunday, and if you count 7 weeks, Shavuos is always on a Sunday. And the Gemara in Menachos even says an amazing thing, that one of the Tzdukim said that the reason it is that way is because Moshe Rabbeinu was an Ohev Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu loved the Jews and knew they would enjoy a 2-day weekend. So this way, by scheduling Shavuos always fall on a Sunday, you have a 2-day weekend. Now we, of course, are spoiled. We always have a 2-day weekend. For us, a 3-day weekend is already something special. But that's the idea. So this error was made. And, of course, we reject the position of the Tzdukim, and we believe that Shabbos in this context means the Yom Tov of Pesach. But the question is a question. Why is it referred to as Shabbos? Because why doesn't the Torah say Mimachras HaPesach? Or Mimachras HaMoed, or some other expression? Because why does it use this very, very unconventional way of referring to Yom Tov, calling it Shabbos, which lends itself to error, unless there's some point that it's coming to be made here. So Reb Tzaddok says an amazing thing. I'll just call it outside, then we'll see his words. He says like this. He says that the first night of Pesach is a very, very special night. It was a very special night back in Egypt, and to a certain extent, that the spirit of that night is replicated every year. Normally, to achieve a certain level, a spiritual level, there is a process of hadraga. There's a step-by-step process. Hadraga is from madrega. There's a step-by-step process. You lay the foundation, and you build on top of that, you build on top of that, you build on top of that, until you achieve whatever it is you achieve spiritually. But sometimes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives it to you all at once. And one very good reason for doing that is because sometimes there's no time to waste. If not now, it'll be never. Now, we've talked about this idea when it comes to the coming of Mashiach. Because Chazal tell us, the Gemara Sanhedrin tells us, that there are various contradictions in Psukim as to the nature of Mashiach's coming. So, for example, the Pasuk says, Ani Hashem bi'ita achishena. In its time, in due course, I will hasten the redemption, which is a contradiction. Which is it? Is it bi'ita? Is it in due course? Or is it achishena? Will it be hastened? So Chazal said like this, Lo zach, if the Jews don't merit, then bi'ita, it'll come in due course. If they merit, achishena, it'll be hastened, it'll come prematurely. There's another Gemara, which means another contradiction. One verse says that Mashiach will come, va'aru menanei shemaya, behold, he will descend from the clouds in a miraculous way. The other pasuk says he'll come as an ani reichav ala chamor, as a poor man riding a donkey, meaning a perfectly natural way. So the Gemara again says the same thing. If the Jews merit, he'll come miraculously from the clouds. If the Jews don't merit, then he'll come as an ani reichav ala chamor. So we once explained that the idea is much more subtle than what we would tend to think. We tend to think if the Jews merit, then they'll be zeichet to miracles. If they don't merit, it'll be natural. It's much more subtle than that. Geula is not an event. Geula is a process. And the process takes time to unfold. A lot of groundwork has to be laid. If the Geula is delayed until the case, until the final deadline, then there will have been enough time for the groundwork to be laid naturally. There'll be no need for any miracles. The because there will have been enough time for everything that has to be prepared to have been prepared, and then it'll be a totally natural process, ani roichav ala chamor, and it will be be'ita in due course. If, on the other hand, Klal Yisrael is unusually deserving, and they have a tremendous chus, and therefore Mashiach comes prematurely, then it'll be miraculous. Why will it be miraculous? Because the preparations that might have required generations will have to be compressed into a very short period of time, and therefore it'll be a miraculous coming.